As Americans, we are taught from an early age to value the study of history as a vital part of our education and our identity as a nation. Study of the American West has been extensive. The number of books published is second only to those written about the Civil War. But within all those volumes, references to African Americans are extremely rare. Today, historians are rediscovering the contributions of African Americans, recognizing their impact as a people, and exploring race relations as they played out in the Wild West. In this 5-part series, Professor Quintard Taylor focuses on African American history in terms of forming communities, combating racism, and changing social and political patterns in the development of the American West. The African American West is presented by the University of Washington's College of Arts and Sciences and the UW Alumni Association. Major funding for this program was provided by Macy's, continuing its long-term commitment to promoting Black history by making this video series available to secondary schools throughout Washington State. Additional funding was provided by the University Bookstore and UW-Medicine. This talk tells the seldom-told story of the Western campaign in the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. Professor Taylor explores the consequences of that struggle to determine if indeed the quote-unquote beloved community, so often proclaimed by civil rights activists in Seattle, actually emerged in the West.
Good evening. My name is Chuck Blumenfeld, and I'm president of the University of Washington Alumni Association. And I want to welcome you to the last of this wonderful series, the African American West, 1528 to 2000. As you know, this lecture series is co-sponsored by the Alumni Association and the College of Arts and Sciences. And it really helps fulfill part of our mission at the Alumni Association, which is to reach, connect, and celebrate alumni and friends of the university in a lifelong relationship with the university. And this is one of our longest running lecture series, and it's a great partnership that's been designed to further our mission. We now present dozens of lectures and events throughout the year to showcase our exceptional faculty and to give alumni and friends of the university an opportunity to be exposed to new ideas and fresh perspectives. It is my pleasure to introduce Quintard Taylor, our speaker. Currently, Quintard is working on a number of interesting projects. He is conducting a study of 20th century Black urban communities in the West, which will be published by the University of Arizona Press. He is also working on a documentary reader on 19th and 20th century African American history for the Thomson Wadsworth, a major publisher of college textbooks. In addition to these projects and doing these lectures, he is working on a collaborative project with Dr. Samuel Kelly, who was the first Vice President of Minority Affairs at the University of Washington. The work is tentatively titled Dr. Sam, the Biography of Samuel E. Kelly, Soldier, Educator, and Advocate. And it will chronicle his remarkable 80-year life and history, and a very important one to this community. These are wonderful examples of the breadth of work being done by Professor Taylor. During this series, Professor Taylor has provided us with a new context for understanding our past. He has shown how our region's inhabitants have dealt with the struggles and conflicts resulting from racial inequality, and we have also seen the influence of the many people who have made a difference, people who were able to surmount the challenges presented to them. Hopefully, Professor Taylor's message will give us all a better understanding of the challenges that still remain in our community. For this, we thank you. What we have learned will stay with us for years to come. And as I introduce Dr. Taylor and ask him to come to the podium, we have a little special gift for you tonight as a commemoration of this wonderful experience you've spent with us. Oh, my God. This is a two-hander.
Oh, boy. I hadn't expected this. I have to free my hands.
On behalf of all of the Alumni Association, the College of Arts and Sciences, all of the sponsors, and all of us, thank you very much for the time and effort and the wonderful breadth of knowledge you've provided us over these last weeks.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Oh, this is heavy. That's very kind. No, I hadn't expected that at all. Actually, it sort of got me off the track from all the things I was going to say. I think I'll just spend the rest of the time talking about the president and forget about the lecture. First of all, again, I am amazed to see so many people here. I'm glad that Chuck mentioned Sam Kelly, and I'm somewhat disappointed that Dr. Kelly is not able to be here tonight. He called me this morning. He's having some difficulties, some medical problems. He's 80 years old, and for the most part, he's pretty spry, but every once in a while, things catch up with him. And he called to tell me about his disappointment in not being here. Had he been here, I would have introduced him to all of you. Many of you know him. Many of you who've been around the university, at least since the 1970s, I'm sure, are aware of Dr. Kelly. He was quite a force, quite a presence on this campus. What you probably don't know is that he was also one of the first African-American officers in the Army to lead an integrated unit in Korea in the early 1950s. I think that's just remarkable. That's a big part of the story that we're going to tell together. Of course, we will also talk about his university years, and then finally, we will talk about the last 20 years in which he's been involved in a variety of projects, the most important of which is the Rosemary Anderson School in Portland, an alternative school for people who have difficulty in high schools and the like. Dr. Kelly has had a remarkable life, and I'm privileged to be able to help to share that life with all of you. I hope you will look forward to the biography, or excuse me, his autobiography, that, with any luck, will be finished by the end of this calendar year. Okay. If you've been following me closely, you know that I've been increasingly focusing my attention on Seattle, and tonight we are going to deal exclusively with Seattle. In many ways, Seattle really represents much of what happens, particularly in terms of the African-American civil rights experience in the West, and it also represents the dilemmas or the issues and the problems facing African-Americans in what I call the post-civil rights period. As you're going to see in a minute, I'm going to enter into a discussion, and I'll be honest with you, I'll be candid with you, with some trepidation, because it's a discussion of contemporary Seattle. This is history that was made within the lifetimes of all of you in this room. And indeed, many of you may have even been participants in this history. And so, of course, if I get it wrong, you'll well correct me. But I want you to be aware of the fact that history continues. It's not just about the 19th century. It's not just about now the 20th century. It's about a continuation of processes of development even into the 21st century. But where we want to start tonight, though, is the civil rights movement in the West, and in particular, the civil rights movement in Seattle. Americans remain fascinated by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Our fascination for the era encompasses a search for its proper place in the nation's history. The civil rights movement has usually been portrayed as a period of Southern black political awakening, where new heroic figures such as Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer led campaigns which secured new laws ensuring equality and opportunity. And of course, we're reminded of these scenes, particularly this month, Black History Month. We know of Martin Luther King at the March on Washington in 1963 and his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We also are reminded, or we should be reminded, of Birmingham in September of 1963, the violence that was going on, the violence that was directed against a number of civil rights demonstrators. Birmingham, of course, with its Bull Connor, Eugene Bull Connor, and the dogs, the police dogs, and the fire hoses. I would argue that this approach to the history of the period is not so much wrong as it's incomplete. The movement was not simply a Southern affair. It was not simply something that happened in the South. It was instead a national transformation, an energizing of small and large African-American communities in the North and in the West, as well as in the South, which pursued, obviously, national goals and had national leadership, but which also pursued a very distinctly local agenda as well. It was demonstrations in places like Spokane in 1964 and 1965, or Portland, Oregon, and of course, as you're going to see in a minute, Seattle, Washington. It was a campaign of ordinary people. and I want to emphasize this phrase, ordinary people, to end job bias or school segregation in their local communities as part of the national campaign, the national effort to eradicate racism and empower African Americans. Seattle, the city farthest removed from the Deep South, offers opportunities for analyzing this approach and for refashioning our views on the era. The Seattle movement, which was an entirely local effort mounted by African Americans and sympathetic whites and Asians in the 1960s, would simultaneously confront with direct action tactics the three major problems facing the Black community at the moment: job discrimination, housing bias, and de facto school segregation. In the time that I have, I will briefly address problems 2 and 3. I will say at the onset that the campaign against housing bias seemed to be a victory. Indeed, in many ways, it was one of the most significant victories, not just for Seattle, but in the entire country in terms of the efforts to try to open up housing for African Americans. However, the problem of de facto school segregation continued to divide Seattle long after the official civil rights movement ended in 1970. Let me provide some background, and indeed, let me go back to the period that we talked about earlier. As we all know now, World War II initiated a rapid and continuous migration that would push Seattle's Black population from 3,700 in 1940 to 37,000 in 1970, and ultimately to 55,000 in the year 2000. As we discussed last week, that influx heightened racial tensions between whites and Blacks, but it also heightened racial tensions between Blacks and Asians and various other groups, as African Americans waged a determined effort to make sure that they were included in the economy of Seattle. Yet Seattle was neither Mississippi nor Chicago. Unlike the South, Black men and Black women in Seattle could vote. Unlike the South, or for that matter, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho, there were no legally segregated schools, and there were no interracial marriage bans. As one observer of the period remarked, African Americans migrated to Seattle because it was the end of the line. There was no better place to go. But Seattle's liberal image masked deep-seated racial fears and anxieties. And I want to point you to the image that we have on the screen right now. Roger Sale is a professor. I think he's retired now, but he was a longtime professor in the English department, and many of you may be familiar with him. Roger Sale was also a civil rights activist. He was also a person who did what he could, and he did a lot to try to change the city, to try to make the city aware of racial inequalities. And look at his statement. I won't read to you that statement, but look at that statement, and look at the last sentence. In Seattle, the ignorance runs deep. Sale had something. I think he was on to something. And indeed, as you see as we work our way through this lecture, you'll see the ignorance in Seattle reflected in a variety of ways. White racism impacted Seattle's African American community in a number of various fashions. First, much of the poverty of the Central District rested on a foundation of job discrimination. Seattle's African Americans made surprisingly little progress during the 1960s, despite the city's Boeing aircraft company boom. And many of you probably don't remember the 1960s in Boeing, but Boeing expanded dramatically, expanded spectacularly. To give you an example, between January of 1965 and December of 1967, Boeing alone added 148,000 new jobs. 148,000 new jobs. Yet an estimated 3,000 Blacks remain unemployed in the Central District, even as Boeing was expanding. A lot of African Americans will tell you, even to this day, that Boeing would recruit people from all over the country, but it wouldn't recruit in the Central District. It wouldn't hire African Americans in the Central District. In October 1967, at the height of the Boeing boom, Black unemployment in Seattle stood at 10%, which was triple the rate for the entire city and a full percentage point above Black unemployment nationally. In other words, African Americans simply weren't sharing in the prosperity that was generated by Boeing and various other companies in Seattle in the 1960s. But secondly, there was increasing ghettoization. In other words, there was an increasing concentration of African Americans in what I call the Central District. The African American population resided almost exclusively in a 12 square mile area in the center of the city. That area contained 85% of Seattle's blacks, including 3,000 African Americans who lived in substandard housing. Again, we don't think about this. We don't think about blacks in substandard housing when we think of Seattle, and yet this is the situation that was emerging. And of course, the growth of the ghetto would lead to the third major issue, the third major problem, the rise of de facto school segregation. In 1950, there were no predominantly black schools. Let me repeat that. In 1950, there were no predominantly black schools in Seattle. 10 years later, 80% of the black children attended school in the Central District, and 5 elementary schools were over 80% African American. 5 elementary schools were over 80%. And you can see the racial breakdown even in the high schools in Seattle in 1962. As a matter of fact, I want to show you this next slide. School segregation in Seattle, some of you may remember Philip Burden, a prominent attorney. Philip Burden talked about the issue early on, almost as soon as he arrived in 1948. He talked about the attempts to try to break down school segregation. This is an old problem. And as you can see, it's a problem that would extend well into the end of the 20th century. Seattle's black leadership eagerly challenged these problems, naively believing that a campaign of civil disobedience would usher in a new period of complete racial equality and opportunity. Indeed, this primarily self-appointed leadership cadre would, throughout the 1960s, determine the civil rights agenda for the Central District. They formed an organization that they call the Central Area Civil Rights Committee to coordinate the activities. And I should say, parenthetically, that this is a remarkable organization in and of itself. It's essentially the leadership of the NAACP and CORE and the Urban League coming together. Rarely in black America in the 1960s did this happen. But somehow or another, these people all got on the same page, as it were, to coordinate civil rights activities, at least for a while. Let me list some of these people, and I'll show you some of the faces. Edwin Pratt, Executive Director of the Seattle Urban League. The 3 ministers, Mance Jackson, Samuel B. McKinney, and John H. Adams. Mance Jackson, of course, of Cherry Hill Baptist Church, Samuel McKinney, of course, of Mount Zion Baptist Church, and John H. Adams of First AME. There was a woman involved, E. June Smith, who was president of the NAACP, and of course you see Reverend McKinney with the bullhorn over there at one of the early protests. And there was also Walter Huntley, and I won't show him right now. He comes up a little bit later in our discussion. But all of these men and June Smith were the core of this Civil Rights Committee. They were a group of activists who were determined to try to change the racial equation in Seattle. In 1973, in an interview 5 years after he left Seattle, Reverend Adams recalled the early days of the civil rights movement. He said, quote, "By 1963, the civil rights movement has finally leaped the Cascade Mountains." By 1963, the civil rights movement has finally leaped the Cascade Mountains. Of the simultaneous campaigns waged by Seattle's civil rights groups in the 1960s, open housing was the most acrimonious and yet ultimately the most successful. Civil rights leaders argued that the city of Seattle would never live up to its liberal image unless and until African Americans could freely reside in every corner of the city. One black real estate agent described the situation thusly, and I'll let you read the statement. And I think he captured the essence of the dilemma for African Americans. African Americans were in effect flying like a fly, buzzing around in a closed jar. In other words, black people were going from place to place in the Central District because essentially we could live nowhere else. And let me give you another image that reflects on this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ennis Arden, or how many of you are familiar with racial restrictions. This is not Birmingham, okay? This is not Atlanta. These are restrictions in Seattle. And this was commonplace. Indeed, one of my colleagues, Jim Gregory, and his researchers have found that well over 85% of the land mass of Seattle was covered by restrictive covenants. What that means is that African Americans, and often it meant Jews, often it meant Asians, often it meant Latinos, various other groups, could not live in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood. It's no accident, folks, that the Central District became the home of African Americans. It was one of the few areas in all of Seattle that wasn't covered by restrictive covenants. African Americans decided something needed to be done about that. In 1962, they urged Seattle Mayor Gordon Clinton to create the Citizens Advisory Committee on Minority Housing. That committee, to the surprise of the mayor, called for an open housing ordinance. And for those of you who are not familiar with, an open housing ordinance simply says one has the right to live anywhere in the city that one chooses. There cannot be racial discrimination to keep people out of certain areas of the city. When the city council delayed action on the ordinance for nearly a year, Reverend Samuel McKinney led 35 young people into the mayor's office for the first sit-in in the history of Seattle. This is July 1st, 1963. Reverend Mance Jackson spoke for the demonstrators and for the impatience of Black Seattle when he declared, "A paternalistic concept of human relations in this country is over. We don't need to be taken care of. We want to be equal participants in our own problem-solving processes." Open housing protests continued into the fall of 1963, and I show 4 images to show you the volume of protests. This was a major effort on the part of not just Seattle's blacks, but also a whole host of whites who were concerned about opening the city or allowing African Americans to live in any and all sections of the city. On October 20th, 2,000 people, about 25% of them white, came out in a blinding rainstorm to Garfield High School to hear the calls for an end to racial segregation in housing. Reverend Samuel Adams, who was one of the keynoters at that rally, reiterated a theme that was increasingly familiar in the city of Seattle. He said the anger and frustration of local blacks was growing and that there was a possibility of violence. But Seattle, unlike eastern cities, could solve its racial problems because its population was still small. Finally, at the last meeting in October of 1963, the City Council passed Seattle's first open housing ordinance. This new law made discrimination in housing by race a crime, punishable by a fine. Councilman Wing Luke, the only Asian American councilman, indeed only the first Asian American councilman to be elected on the mainland of the United States, was the person who introduced the measure. However, that wasn't the end of the story. Open housing opponents immediately instituted a successful petition campaign to place the measure on the ballot for March 10th, 1964, for the March 10th, 1964 citywide election. In other words, they said that the people of Seattle ought to vote on this ordinance, and they ought to vote on whether or not there should be open housing in the city. A number of homeowners in the city feared the property values would decline with open housing, and their views were going to be expressed by Philip Bailey in an editorial in the Argus on March 6, 1964. I'll let you read the editorial. In March of 1964, Seattle voters rejected the open housing ordinance by a huge margin, 112,000 to 53,000. In other words, Seattle, even liberal Seattle, said publicly that it was opposed to open housing. In the aftermath of the defeat, Seattle's civil rights leaders vowed that they would continue their campaign. They were openly defiant in the face of that vote. They said that they would initiate a campaign of civil disobedience in the summer of 1964. And indeed, Reverend John H. Adams declared that Seattle would be in for a long, hot summer. But I would suggest that the long, hot summer never came. Actually, long, hot summers never come to Seattle anyway. The intense public debate over open housing persuaded a small segment of white Seattle to begin to open its arms to African American neighbors. Let me give you an example here. Felicita Schoenfeld, 1964. She writes a letter to a civil rights group, and she says, "We will welcome African Americans." And hers is just the opening salvo in a campaign that's going to continue throughout 1964 and 1965. Indeed, by 1965, a small but steady stream of African Americans will begin to leave the Central District and move into integrated housing throughout Seattle. Now, it's not much. Indeed, it's a movement that's almost imperceptible at that point. But it's the beginning of a change that eventually is going to take on momentous proportions. In 1965 and 1966, 2 organizations in the suburbs of Seattle come online to promote open housing. The Kirkland Fair Housing Organization and Operation Equality in Federal Way. They open up suburban housing to African Americans. But one of the most remarkable activists at this period, and the man who's probably forgotten by many of us now and who should not be, was Sidney Gerber. And I don't know how many of you know Sidney Gerber, but Sidney Gerber essentially took it on his own to create an organization, a company indeed, called Harmony Homes. And Harmony Homes essentially bought open land in the suburbs of Seattle and built houses expressly for people of color, houses that would be occupied expressly for people of color. Now, these were small steps, but they were steps that would sort of turn the tide in terms of the idea or the concept of open housing. By April of 1968, the Seattle City Council again revisited the question of open housing. It passed a second open housing ordinance, this one introduced by Sam Smith, who was newly elected to the City Council. And this council said there will be no discrimination based upon race in housing selection throughout the city of Seattle. Now, I would argue, I will be completely candid with you and say that part of the reason for the passage of this measure, and by the way, it passed unanimously, it passed the City Council unanimously. Part of the reason for this measure was no doubt the fact that Martin Luther King had been assassinated on April 4th, and many of the cities across the country were literally in flames at the moment that the City Council was debating this issue. And so there is a huge national backdrop to this. But I would also argue that by 1968, the City Council of Seattle recognized that a lot of housing had been opened up voluntarily, that a number of African Americans were beginning to move outside of the Central District. The extent of the transformation of white attitudes about open housing became apparent 1 month after the Seattle City Council had made its momentous decision. In the month of May, 30,000 King County residents, primarily white, non-Central District homeowners, signed open housing petitions. 30,000 white homeowners throughout King County signed open housing petitions. Folks, there was nothing like this happening anywhere else in the country in 1968 or 1969 or the early 1970s. Seattle and King County began a slow but steady process of residential integration. This is the growth of the integrated areas, Rainier Valley, obviously, but also certain other areas in the city of Seattle as well. I want to draw your attention, though, to the quote there and the author of that quote. Some of you may know him. Dean, where are you? Oh, here we are. The dean was an assistant professor at the time. I love this dean. Can I embarrass you? He was assistant professor at the time, and he spoke to the question of housing integration in Seattle in 1981. But he spoke and I'm not even sure that he was aware that in 1981, this was part of a much larger trend that was going on that would eventually look like this. This is the decline of residential segregation in Seattle between 1960 and the year 2000. Folks, that map, the map on the right, shows the spread of African American households throughout King County. Now, yes, there is still significant concentration in the city of Seattle, but it's certainly no longer concentrated in the Central District itself. As a matter of fact, to give you an idea of the significance of this development, there were only 3 cities in the entire country where by the year 2000, more African Americans lived outside of the central city, not the Central District, the central city or the major city than inside it. And those cities were Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. In other words, Seattle had become one of the most residentially integrated cities in the country by that time. And I would argue that much of that integration took place because of the efforts of blacks and whites and Asians in the city of Seattle in the 1960s. Yet, even as I say that, even as we congratulate ourselves on the fact that we had achieved this milestone in terms of residential integration, we have to understand that this victory is tempered by the knowledge that a whole host of black folks remain trapped in poverty in the Central District. And indeed, many of them remain trapped in poverty in the Central District right to this day. If the open housing campaign was a surprising success, the campaign against de facto school segregation must be seen as a stunning failure. All of us in this room know the consequences of that failed effort. And we all know that that failed effort continued well into the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to talk about the reasons for that failure. I think there are three major reasons. The first reason has to do with the fact that, and I'll just be candid with you, a huge number of whites, even whites who were, ironically, in many instances, racially liberal on other questions, oppose mandatory busing. And we'll try to explore this. We'll try to deal with this in depth in a few minutes. But there was a tremendous opposition to mandatory busing throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And that opposition to mandatory busing meant that effective, well, completely effective desegregation wouldn't come until relatively late. But there was also, but the failure also came because the campaign for ending de facto segregation would ultimately split the African American community itself. Eventually, there would be blacks who would favor the end of de facto segregation, but there would be a growing number of blacks who would argue that it was far more important. It was far more important for African Americans to have quality schools within the central district and within the black neighborhoods than for black kids to simply sit next to white kids. But I would also suggest that the failure came because both local and national civil rights leaders lost their way. And this is where I think it becomes a bit controversial. I know a lot of you are not going to agree with me on this. But when I say they lost their way, I mean that many, many people who embrace school desegregation and embrace busing as a tactic to bring about that school desegregation in order to improve, as they saw it, the quality of black life, failed to make the distinction between busing as a tactic and busing as ultimately a goal in itself. When that distinction was not made, there were a whole host of political mistakes that were going to be made that would follow from that, and those political mistakes would haunt the city for a very long time. The roots of this thinking about segregation and about the importance of busing can be found up here. This is Henry Louis Gates, and he's talking about how black people thought about the question of school segregation. We believe the school segregation was wrong. We had been taught this, we had seen this. Many of us had grown up in segregated schools in the South. We knew instinctively that segregated schools were wrong. That's not the issue. The problem is, how do you desegregate? The problem is, how do you bring about a desegregation or an integration of those schools that will bring about the best possible solution for African Americans and for the whites who are around them? Unfortunately, that was the dilemma that was never really resolved. In 1957, the Seattle School Board took its first census of enrollment by race, and it found out something that was at least startling to them at that moment. First, they found out that only 5% of the 5% of the 91,000 students in the district were black. But they also found out that 81% of all of the black students were attending schools in the Central District. In other words, segregated schools had emerged, despite the laws preventing this, despite a history in which Seattle had said adamantly that it would not allow this kind of development. Segregated schools had emerged in Seattle. Listen to the words of Walter Hundley. We know the consequences when Negroes are forced to go to school together in their pin-up sections of the city. They learn to hate. Hundley was speaking not just about Seattle, he was speaking about a racial history that extended all over the country, and he was applying that maxim to Seattle at that moment. Hundley and other civil rights activists swung into action. At the urging of the Seattle Civil Rights Committee, the Seattle School Board initiated, reluctantly, the Voluntary Racial Transfer Program, or the VRT, in 1963. That voluntary racial transfer program would send an estimated 1,400 of 7,000 black pupils out of the Central District into white schools, or predominantly white schools, throughout the city. They would do this, the board said, to end the racial isolation of black children in the public schools. The announcement came, ironically, on August 28, 1963, the day that Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The Seattle School District and the city of Seattle thus became the first major city in the country to voluntarily undertake a district-wide school desegregation plan. Let me repeat that. Seattle becomes the first city in the country to voluntarily desegregate its schools. Now that's something to be, for which the city ought to be congratulated. But unfortunately, history shows that there are complexities even when people attempt to do well. Civil rights leaders declared that the voluntary desegregation program advanced by the city school board was not enough. That indeed those civil rights leaders called for essentially the schools in the Central District to be closed and all of the African American children to be bused throughout the city. It was a bold move. It was a move that was done without consultation with a lot of black parents, but it was a move that civil rights leaders believed, maybe naively, believed would somehow or another ensure that there would be quality education. As a result of this, the civil rights leaders decided to wage, if you will, a campaign to try to pressure the school board into action. There were marches, there were demonstrations, there were other kinds of protests, all of which through 1965 seemed ineffectual. In 1966, they came up with a new strategy, a boycott of the schools. In other words, tell the black kids not to go to school, and this would be a 1 to 2 day protest. Tell the black kids not to go to school to show the displeasure of the black community with the continued segregation. Indeed, that boycott would take place on March 31st and April 1st of 1966. The so-called freedom schools were created on those days, and during that time period, an estimated 55% of the overall black student enrollment in the public schools in Seattle participated in this boycott. And in some elementary schools, 80% of the black students participated in the boycott. And let me explain here. When I say boycott, I mean that they not only did not go to the public schools, they went to special schools that were set up in the Central District. For instance, 500 children ended up going to Reverend McKinney's Mount Zion Church, others went to Temple de Hirsch, others went to various other locations in the Central District. This was an amazing situation because essentially black kids are going to these schools, these freedom schools, and they are attending for the first time these schools with whites and sympathetic white students and sympathetic Asian students. The freedom schools were an amazing experiment. They were an attempt to bring kids together over or across the barrier of race. They were an attempt to say that the schools indeed can be integrated. I want to draw your attention to Emily Hansen. I don't know very much about Emily Hansen, but she was one of the people who participated, one of the young kids who participated in the boycott. And I want you to read her words here. They're very poignant words. These kids, along with their parents, along with the civil rights leaders, wanted change. They wanted an integrated education because they sincerely believed that integration was ultimately in the best interest of African Americans and all the people of Seattle. They wanted what was best for black children. Unfortunately, their position was not universally shared. Increasingly, a number of black parents in the school district were going to be influenced by other streams of thought, by other ideas about school segregation and school integration. Indeed, by 1967, we would see the rise of black power. By 1967, we would see the rise of black power, not just nationally, but also in Seattle. By 1967, the Nation of Islam would emerge as a powerful, influential force in the Central District. By 1967, there would be other black power groups that would emerge in the Central District. And they indeed would argue that integration is not in the best interest of black children. That black children sitting next to white children is not automatic. It's not a sign of automatic progress. They would argue that black children should be educated in black schools. They got a hearing. These black power advocates got a hearing in 1967 with the visit of none other than Stokely Carmichael. And I don't know if many of you remember Stokely Carmichael, but he became the symbol of black power in 1966 and 1967. Stokely Carmichael came to Garfield High in 1967, in April of 1967, after addressing an audience at the University of Washington. He rarely visited high schools, but this time he made an exception. When he came to Garfield, 4,000 people came out to hear him. Carmichael, of course, as you can see here, talked about the need for African Americans to challenge the integrationists. He said that the integrationists were slowly destroying the African American community. And then, of course, he said these words. Essentially, Carmichael called for an alternative view, and Carmichael wasn't alone here. Carmichael and others called for an alternative view to the question of integration in society. The political repercussions of Carmichael's visit surfaced the following August with a new organization in Seattle. The organization was called the Central Area Committee for Peace and Improvement. It was a Black Power organization, and it was an organization that was dedicated not to integration of the schools, but to control of the African American schools. The committee presented a list of demands to the school board, which included the introduction of Black, Asian, and Indian history into the curriculum of every school in the city, and the hiring of additional minority teachers and counselors, especially in the Central District. But this wasn't the end. Essentially, they continued to organize, and on March 6, 1968, there would be a confrontation between the integrationists and the Black Power advocates at the East Madison, or actually the Meredith Matthews YMCA. Imagine the scene. I want to give you a kind of a verbal picture of the scene. 400 people came to discuss whether or not Seattle, or at least Black Seattle, would pursue segregated schools or integrated schools. And of course, the Black Power advocates didn't talk in terms of segregated schools. They talked in terms of schools in which Black people would control the education, Black people would control the curriculum. These people who came to Meredith Matthews represented a wide spectrum of ideology within the African American community. No longer were the integrationists essentially in control of the discussion. In fact, to get a little bit ahead of myself, the integrationists would be swept off the platform. Reverend Adams attempted to control the meeting. He lost control of the meeting, and he lost control of the meeting to two groups, the Nation of Islam and the newly formed Black Student Union at the University of Washington. These groups argued differently. These groups argued that integration wasn't the key to racial progress. The integrationists, according to one observer, were, quote, swept off the platform. And not surprisingly, soon afterwards, Reverend Adams resigned his position in Seattle, and he assumed pastoral duties at a Los Angeles church. Civil rights leaders saw the meeting as a capitulation to hysteria, in the words of Walter Huntley. Yet other activists, others who were not in the civil rights fold, saw this as an assertion of working class Blacks in an area heretofore dominated by Black professionals. Listen to the words of future school board member Alfred Cowles. Quote, the professional Black leaders said that integration is going to be painful, so accept the pain that goes with it. But working class Blacks, according to Cowles, said we've been suffering pain far too long. Let the other groups suffer some pain. In other words, there was growing anger in African American Seattle about the fact that integration seemed to come only on the backs of African American students. And let me provide some background on this. The problem, as far as these Black Power advocates were concerned, goes all the way back to the time that the civil rights advocates called for the closure of all the Central District schools. The assumption, the operating assumption, was that Black kids should leave the Central District and go elsewhere. The operating assumption was that the education that they would receive outside of the Central District or in predominantly white schools would automatically be better. And a lot of these Black Power advocates began to challenge that notion. By 1970, the campaign for school desegregation had come in full circle. Blacks, whites, and Asians, I would argue, all wanted quality education for their children, but they could not agree on what is meant by quality education. They could not agree on how to achieve that quality education in Seattle at that time. Growing number of parents of all colors resisted court-ordered busing when there was the inkling of that coming down the road. And indeed, they called for if you will, they increasingly call for, if you will, neighborhood control of their schools. The campaign against de facto school segregation now divided blacks and whites, but it also pitted blacks against blacks and whites against whites in a search for a practical solution to the isolation of Seattle's children. You know, I have to tell you that when I wrote this lecture, I was told that this is going to be very difficult, and I think it is becoming difficult. I can see it in the expressions on some of your faces. Let me say it like this: there are no heroes here. You know, the lectures in the past have talked heroically about African Americans overcoming various situations. There is some of that here. There is certainly some of that here. But there is also much more contingency. There's also much more conflict. There's also much more angst about what's going on. There is no right answer. And that's, I think, that's what makes history itself so meaningful, because often there is no right answer. Often people can disagree fundamentally on various approaches. And let me say this, and I guess I should have added in the text of the lecture, because I sort of assumed that people knew a lot about this. It's essentially the split that's going on in the African American community, because this is what I'm focusing on. The split that's going on in the African American community is in some ways class-based. That is, that working class people, to some extent, are beginning to challenge middle class activists who had dominated the civil rights movement. But it's also a split that's based upon a kind of ideology, an ideology around the notion of integration. There are a lot of people, there are a whole host of people who, through the civil rights movement, believed that integration was the panacea, that integration, the integration of society, was the goal that we all should work for. And certainly that is a noble goal, that's a noble purpose. But increasingly, a number of African American activists, and we may not necessarily agree with them, a number of African American activists were saying integration is not the goal, or should not be the goal should be freedom. The goal should be self-determination. The goal should be the ability for African Americans to control their destiny. If that comes through integration, then that's fine. If it comes through various other processes, then that ought to be recognized as well. Well, this was difficult. This was difficult for the integrationists to hear. It was difficult in some instances for those who were, I would call, anti-integration to make that case. And that made for very difficult situations in terms of the debates going on in the late 1960s. But as you're going to see in a minute, those debates would intensify in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. As I said before, there are no heroes here. But there is an attempt, an honest effort, there's an attempt by various factions of the African American community and various factions of the white and Asian and Native American communities to try to figure out what is in the best interest of the entire community. And there are fits and there are starts and there are attempts to try to move in various directions. All of it's, if you will, all of it's well-meaning, but all of it doesn't have the same impact. All of it doesn't have the same result. And in many instances, there will be people who will appear to be working at cross purposes in this effort. Let me talk about the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, because that's the era of busing. And folks, I can tell you right now, well, I don't need to tell you, busing was one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial issue in Seattle and in the country throughout the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Political careers were made on, if you will, the opposition to busing. All we have to do is think about Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon comes to mind. But all we have to do is think about Ronald Reagan, because and we may have forgotten this, but to a large extent, Ronald Reagan's appeal in a lot of areas of the country revolved around questions of race, and particularly his stand on busing. So what I'm going to explain to you here in terms of Seattle is the Seattle story, but we have to remember it's the Seattle story against the backdrop of a nationwide debate, a nationwide campaign that's going on about the issue of busing. The campaign about integration, or the end of de facto segregation in Seattle, did not begin in 1970. Indeed, as we've already established, there are echoes of that go all the way back to 1954. And it intensified in the 1960s, the late 1960s. As early as 1968, Forbes Bottomley, the first of many Seattle school district superintendents who would grapple with the question of race and education, said of busing, this is before Seattle had committed itself to busing for racial integration. Quote, many authoritarian decisions will have to be made by the school board. If we're going to move ahead, I'm afraid it's going to have to be by that route. If we're going to move ahead, I'm afraid it's going to have to be by that route. He didn't know how prophetic he was. He didn't realize when he made that statement that busing would be the key to understanding the racial dilemma of Seattle through most of that time period. Yet I would submit to you that neither the African American community nor the rest of Seattle was ready for authoritarian decisions in that regard. And indeed, they would never prove to be completely ready to that. Black parents in the Central District began in 1969 the Central Area School Council. That school council was headed by Mrs. Jerry Ware. And she and others like her believed that Central District parents ought to take the initiative for improving the schools within their area. Not necessarily promoting integration, but for improving the schools within the Central District. They made the argument that with better teachers, with better curriculum, with better counselors, those schools would improve, the test scores of the kids in the schools would improve, and those schools would become effective agents in terms of delivering education. The Central Area School Council, under Ware, carved out a specific position whereby they were able to negotiate with the school board, remarkably, the placing of teachers in the Central District schools. They placed young white teachers and African American or minority teachers in the Central District schools, and remarkably, those schools began, or at least the kids, began to perform better. It seemed to some that this was an answer to the dilemma of education in the Central District. Ironically, even as Ware and others were beginning to tout this, there were others in the community, including others in the African American community, that were touting something else, that were saying improvements in the Central District schools are simply not enough, that you've got to integrate, that you've got to get the kids out of those predominantly black schools and in the schools across the city. Parents increasingly were interested in integrated education, but they disagreed on exactly how to bring that integrated education about. And those in the black community, or many in the black community, said, and I quote, "We don't want our children going to those white schools, especially when the schools here in the Central District are gaining in terms of quality education." These parents, in effect, wanted better education, and they felt that they had a solution to this. They felt that they had a way to bring this about. But regardless of what these black parents wanted, or regardless of the wishes of white parents or Asian parents, busing was coming. In September of 1972, a mandatory school desegregation program was instituted by the school board. It involved, at first, only 624 students. These students were chosen by computer, and they would, in effect, be bused across town to various locales outside of their neighborhood in order to promote what would be called racial balance. In other words, the idea was that by busing kids across town, they would help to affect or help to bring about quality education. There was opposition from the very beginning. On the day in which the day before, or the night before, the busing program was supposed to begin in Seattle, approximately 75 buses had their tires slashed. In other words, vandals came in and slashed the tires of the majority of buses that were going to carry these students. In other words, Seattleites, or at least some Seattleites, were beginning to show their opposition to busing. But I would argue that despite the slashed tires, Seattle was hardly South Boston or Gage Park in Chicago, where riots broke out when busing programs began in the early 1970s. A lot of us perhaps don't remember this or don't recall this, but in the early 1970s, there was tremendous tension all over the country, certainly all over urban America, because of busing to bring about racial integration. Now, I would argue that there seemed to be less fundamental opposition to busing to integrate the schools in Seattle than in other cities. In places like Gage Park in Chicago, in places like South Boston, there was fundamental opposition to any effort to integrate the schools. In other words, it didn't matter if it was busing or anything else. In Seattle, I think increasingly parents said, we don't want our kids bused in order to bring about racial integration. And the way in which they they touted their opposition was by withdrawing their kids, withdrawing their students from the schools. In other words, we see, beginning in 1972 and continuing throughout the 1990s, white flight. Look at these figures. These figures are dramatic. They show the declining enrollment of white students in the Seattle public schools. Now, I would be the first to argue that there are a variety of reasons for the declining enrollment. I would argue that Seattle families were becoming smaller. I would argue that there were growing numbers of people of color in the city of Seattle. But I think we can't get away from, as we look at these figures, we can't get away from the fact that a lot of parents, a lot of white parents, opted to take their kids out of school. You see, for instance, a concomitant rise, a dramatic rise in the number of kids in private schools, white kids in private schools. You also see many white parents essentially enrolling their kids in suburban schools, even though the parents remain in the city. The situation became so very difficult that the school board had to scramble to see how can we affect integration and at the same time keep white students in the school district. And in order to do this, they came up with what they felt was a novel device. They came up with the magnet schools. In other words, schools that would have superior programs that would hopefully hold the attention of white students and Asian students, as well as keep black students in the area so that integration could be effective. Cleveland High School, and in 1970, this is 1971, but Cleveland High School in 1972 had one of the first magnet programs. And anybody in here who's familiar with Garfield knows that Garfield is one of the exceptional places in terms of magnet schools. But there's a problem. The magnet schools, unfortunately, did not work. There was a tremendous amount of opposition to them, and let me suggest the various ways in which that opposition was going to be acted out. First of all, magnet schools, for all of their success, did not stop white flight. They did not stop white parents from taking their kids out of the school district. Secondly, magnet schools prompted fear on the part of black parents, especially in places like Garfield and in neighborhood junior high schools, where African Americans had been the majority. There was a fear that they would no longer be the majority. There was a fear that these would no longer be their schools. Now there's a paradox here. On one hand, integrationists are arguing we ought to close these schools down or we ought to get the black kids out of these schools and move them across town. But there was a lot of neighborhood pride in Garfield. There was a lot of neighborhood pride in Median. There was a lot of neighborhood pride in some of the other schools. And as bad as some of those schools appeared to be, there were a lot of black parents who said they at least are our schools. They at least are our schools. And so there was a conflict there. Thirdly, the ACLU and the NAACP, the chief proponents of mandatory busing, were very, very clear. They said the magnet schools busing undermine school integration. That is, as long as magnet schools were in place, that you couldn't have the full integration of the schools in Seattle. Then there's an extra element to come into play here. Asian parents in the International District were increasingly concerned and fearful that magnet schools would undermine the bilingual programs that they had worked for a number of years to try to bring about effective education for their children. But ultimately, the most important opponent to magnet schools in Seattle was the federal government. The most important opponent was the federal government. The government increasingly applied pressure on the school board to institute a mandatory busing program. The government argued that unless there's a mandatory program, funding could be cut off for Seattle schools, and there could be other legal action taken against the district. The board succumbed to that pressure, and in the spring of 1978, it voted to institute for the first time a mandatory busing program, despite the opposition of most of the city's white, black, and Asian parents. I want to emphasize this now. We usually think that black parents are in favor of busing, white parents are opposed to it. In this particular instance, the majority of parents of almost any race were opposed to busing. Regardless of whether they were opposed to it, busing came to Seattle. It came to Seattle without a court order, as one of the famous authors of the period wrote. But I would argue that it did not come without the threat of a court order. In other words, the pressure of the federal government forced the school board to call for busing. Now, white opposition, again, did not take the form of violent protests as in Boston and Chicago. However, the parents often voted with their children's feet. In other words, they continued to see, the school district continued to see the decline in the number of students. I'm putting up here a statement by Charles Royer. Charles Royer, of course, was the mayor at the time, a mayor in 1980, and he's one of a number of politicians that remarkably attempted to try to deal with this situation. Royer offered leadership, but unfortunately it was a leadership that fell on deaf ears because there were so many people of various political persuasions who were increasingly opposed to busing. Let me give you an example of the opposition to busing. Franklin High School, for instance, in 1978, was supposed to receive 500 white students from the North End as part of the busing program. In other words, white students would be bused into Franklin High School. Only 250 came in the first 3 months, and by the end of the year, less than 100 were coming. Many of those students who dropped out of this program eventually ended up in private schools or elsewhere. Ironically, and there was all kinds of irony here in terms of the busing situation, ironically, white flight actually created spaces in North End schools. For instance, Roosevelt, because it lost so many white students, now could take a growing number of black and Latino and Asian students. Yet at the same time, the schools in the South End were growing by leaps and bounds. In other words, they were getting increasingly crowded because more and more Asians were coming to the city of Seattle. If the opposition to busing in the 1970s had been most pronounced in the northern end or at the north end of town, by the 1980s, it shifted to the South End. By the 1980s, black and Asian parents noted that their students, their children, I should say, their children comprise a disproportionate number of people who were bused. In other words, it's not just the fact that busing is taking place, who is carrying the burden of the busing? A lot of these black and Asian parents would argue that increasingly effectively. The school board claimed, and I think they were correct in this, that there were more vacancies in the North End schools, and therefore black and Asian kids should be bused to those North End schools. Yet the parents argued, and I think equally correctly, that the money that was spent on busing should have been spent on equalizing facilities. Case in point, musically inclined students at Roosevelt High School could choose from among a number of options. They could either take jazz choir, they could take concert band, they could take classic or concert orchestra, they could take concert choir, among other programs. Those students who went to Rainier Beach High School had one option, generalized music instruction. Folks, and I did some checking on this, that's the situation right to this day. That is the situation right to this day. While busing advocates claimed that the disparity vindicated their support for busing, a growing number of parents wondered if this was the only way to achieve quality education. Among black parents, increasingly class differences mattered. In other words, middle-class black parents supported busing. They almost adamantly supported busing, even when they themselves were taking their kids out of the public schools and increasingly enrolling them in private schools. Community leader Elmer Dixon reflected the growing difference of opinion in the black community when he said, quote, "No one asked the black community what they thought about busing. The leadership just picked it up and they started running with it." And this is a statement that applied not only to 1985 when he uttered it, it applied to 1965, 1966, 1967. The busing controversy had always moved strangely, almost unpredictably through the city's history. Now it took yet another ironic turn. As African American students comprise a growing percentage of the total school enrollment, the influence of black parents and black education experts and advocates grew proportionally. By 1984, 3 African Americans, T.J. Vassar, Michael Preston, Jerry Salter, were all sitting on the school board out of a total of 7 members. In other words, African Americans had disproportionate power on the school board at that moment, precisely because busing had in effect removed a lot of white parents from the discussion of and interest in those schools. Yet also by 1984, only a handful of schools in Seattle remained racially segregated. In other words, in 1984, it seemed that the busing advocates had achieved what they wanted. It seemed finally, although in some ways sort of incidentally and ironically because of the large number of white students who have been removed from the system, it seemed finally that integrated education had been achieved. But had it? One of the promises, perhaps the promise of integrated education, was the fact that it would improve the quality of instruction for African American students, and as a consequence, African American student test scores would improve. In other words, why integrate if it's not to make sure that there's a better education? Why integrate if not to ensure that black kids get equal educational opportunities and they grow with those opportunities? Unfortunately, though, by 1985, I want to go to this next image, and I'm sorry, it's going to be hard to read this. By 1985, even though integration, quote unquote, had been achieved, the Seattle School District reported that there was an education gap, that there was an achievement gap. And those are words that ring true even to this day. We are still talking about, unfortunately, the achievement gap. Let me give you the figures. In 1985, according to the school district, fewer than 1 in 5 black students in grades 9 to 12 carried a grade point average of C+ or better. Latino and Native American students had similar scores, yet blacks were about 25% of the enrollment in the public schools of Seattle at that time. In contrast, 54% of white students and 67% of Asian students earned a C+ or higher. In other words, the achievement gap had become real. At the moment when we were concerned about busing, at the moment when we were concerned about making sure that students would sit in integrated classrooms, we had forgotten about the whole purpose of education, which is to educate. School board member Michael Preston was the first to break ranks from the old alliance that had talked about, that had pushed for busing. He said that it's now time to place less of a priority on school desegregation and a higher priority on quality education for African American students. He was immediately attacked. Oscar Eason publicly declared that Preston was, quote, the best friend that the segregationists ever had, unquote. I think that's unfair, but nonetheless, it speaks to the growing divisions, it speaks to the growing tension within the African American community about the issue of busing. This is Lacey Steele. Lacey Steele was the president of the Seattle NAACP at the time. Lacey Steele vowed to fight for busing, even if it meant promoting busing in those neighborhoods that were already racially integrated, prompting one WAG to say, it seems that now busing is the goal more than quality education. You can see Steele's comment here. Nonetheless, by the late 1980s, a new group of leaders were beginning to emerge who challenged the notion that busing was the only way to achieve quality education. Indeed, these leaders would have been condemned in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and I'll talk about some of those leaders in a minute. Actually, let me discuss one right now. James Kelly. Many of you know James Kelly as the head of the Urban League. James Kelly, in 1988, founded an organization called the Black Community Coalition, which focused specifically on the achievement gap. Kelly said, and he said something that increasingly was going to resonate with a number of black parents, that closing the achievement gap was more important than desegregating the schools. Closing the achievement gap was far more important than the money that was spent for busing at the time. Eventually, he would call for the creation of the African American Academy. And the African American Academy would be one bold measure. It would be an attempt to try to create an academically wholesome environment where African American students would thrive. We can talk later in the question and answer sessions about whether that was achieved, but nonetheless, that was the goal in the early 1990s. The Academy opened in 1991, and of course, you can see the groundbreaking for the finished building that was completed by the year 2001. And of course, many of you may be familiar with the African American Academy. Unfortunately, though, African American Academy aside, the white flight continued from the school districts. In other words, white students were continuing to leave the school district, but now white flight had morphed into what I call middle class flight, as black and Asian parents also took their kids out of the public schools as well. Indeed, you couldn't even go to a private school and be assured of an education with nothing but white students. By 1990, 1 in 5 private school students was a student of color. 1 in 5 private school students was a student of color. In other words, the middle class had pretty well effectively deserted the public schools of Seattle. I think there are 2 comments that indicate the changed attitudes and their consequences. Earl Detman, chairman of the African American Parents Council, told the school board hearing in 1990 that the black parents in the Central District now agreed with white parents in the North End that, quote, the ability to choose schools closer to home is far more important than desegregation. School board president Al Sugiyama, the first Asian American board member, said, and I'm quoting here, the mandatory busing program interferes with the district's efforts to improve poor schools and reduce the achievement gap. By 1995, the major opponents of school busing on the Seattle School Board were Michael Preston and Al Sugiyama. In other words, a black man and an Asian American man. They would soon be joined by a crucial ally, the new superintendent of public schools, John Stanford. Stanford was a retired general. You know the story. I mean, you guys were here when Stanford was here. He was a retired general with absolutely no experience in running public schools, and yet some have argued, not me, some have argued that he was the most dynamic public school superintendent that we've had. Certainly he shook things up, and certainly he was probably the only one who could in effect take us away, or take the city and take the school board away from the idea of busing. In October of 1997, Stanford proposed the end to the district's 20-year-old program of mandatory busing. To address the achievement gap, Stanford introduced a new school financing formula that promised more money for low-income students. On November 5th, 1997, the Seattle School Board voted 6-1 to end mandatory school busing. Folks, very few people mourn the passing of mandatory school busing. The Seattle Times, which is the most vocal proponent of mandatory busing throughout those years, had this editorial comment on July 30th, 1995, 2 years before the vote. How then do we assess this 20-year experiment? And remember those words, 20-year experiment. In other words, from 1977 to 1997, the city of Seattle dedicated itself to mandatory school busing to try to bring about racial balance. How do we assess this 20-year experience? Well, there's one group, indeed, and this group is fairly large, who believe that this experiment was a complete failure. Former Seattle School Superintendent David Moberly, the official who ushered into existence the first busing plan, said in 1987, quote, some people sincerely believed that busing would result in better education, yet there was never any evidence anywhere at all that it did. While Moberly is correct, I believe, and I'm going to go out on dangerous ground here, but I believe that there were positive outcomes that flowed from this desegregation effort. Yes, overall, busing was problematic. Overall, mandatory busing was not supported by significant segments of the population everywhere. But I believe this 20-year experiment did have some positives, that flowed from it. First, desegregation, whether through mandatory busing or other means, desegregation ended the isolation of Seattle's black kids. Desegregation, let me repeat that, desegregation ended the isolation, the racial isolation of Seattle's black kids. No longer could Seattle students claim a geographic ignorance, and particularly black students, a geographic ignorance about the rest of the city. In other words, before busing and before the attempt to integrate the schools, there had been, if you will, a kind of parochialism in schools. People identified with schools and neighborhoods, and they didn't see beyond those schools and beyond those neighborhoods. Busing, for all of its faults, got those kids out of those neighborhoods and moved them into large areas of the city so that they would begin to know and understand the city in ways that their predecessors could never imagine. Secondly, I believe the busing may have reduced the pressure to maintain segregated neighborhoods. Now, busing wasn't a complete panacea in this regard. There will still be attempts to maintain segregation. But I think eventually, as blacks moved throughout the city, One of the reasons they would be accepted in various areas is precisely because their kids were indeed going to school with kids of other races throughout the city as well. In other words, busing itself and school desegregation paved the way for residential integration. It should have been the other way around. Had there been residential integration to begin with, there would have been no need for busing. But at least in this instance, busing at least will be indirectly responsible for the rise of residential integration. Thirdly, the desegregation efforts opened educational opportunities and experiences of the entire city to each student. Theoretically, students from throughout the city could avail themselves of special programs. Now here we're talking about the magnet schools. And yes, they had plenty of critics, and some of the critics were probably right in their arguments. But the magnet schools, and Garfield was one of them, the magnet schools created an environment, created a situation whereby gifted students, whereby students with special talents and special needs got the attention and care that they did not receive prior to 1965. Fourthly, although the evidence is less certain here, I'm on shaky ground here, I believe that desegregation helped to prepare Seattle for an array of black office holders, including a black mayor, a black county executive, a black school board president, a series of black school board presidents, I should say, and of course a black school board superintendent. Folks, I would argue that the rise of these office holders in the 1980s and 1990s, some of whom are sitting in this room, the rise of these office holders, I think, would have been much more difficult, much more problematic, had not busing sort of convulsed the city. Indeed, there are various ways of looking at this. In one way, African Americans became political actors, even if they were moving in different directions. They became political actors across the city as a whole in ways that were unimagined in the 1950s and the 1960s. But another way of looking at this is to suggest that the desegregation of the schools, no matter how they came about, prompted people all over the city, to begin to think about African American politicians and activists in different ways. Now, all of these changes, however, were not enough to deal with or to overcome the trauma of busing itself. Yet, I will argue that there were those who, even to this day, will claim the benefit of busing. I'm going to conclude this lecture with the statement of these two young women. They are veterans of busing. I don't know if you know them. It's probably not important for you to know them, but know their words. These are two Seattleites who remember busing. The development of these sentiments are wonderful. I laud them. I think it's very important I think they're very important. I think they reflect the racial progress that we've made. Racial progress that would have been very hard to imagine in 1965, 1966, or even 1972. Nonetheless, as I stand before you tonight, I understand that one of the major promises of busing, one of the major promises of mandatory busing, the idea of improved black performance, has still not been achieved. It has not been achieved right to this day, and we don't know, we really don't know when that will take place. Maybe someday in the future, when someone else comes and gives a lecture, they can tell you a happy ending to the story. They can tell you how the achievement gap was ended. But tonight, we're not prepared to do so. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. We have time for questions? We have some time for questions. I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot of questions. I think I've managed to make a lot of people angry tonight. Questions? Have I made you so angry that you're not going to raise any questions? Yes. Yes.
Professor Taylor, my name is Larry Gossett, and
I know. I know. Larry's one of the politicians.
Yeah, and I was one of the founders of the University of Washington Black Student Union in 1968. And I had a question about that part of your lecture. Mm-hmm. It sounded like you were saying that those who were advocating for black power were kind of reinforcing racial segregation. And mm-hmm. I never remembered at that mm-hmm. time that we talked anything about maintaining segregation, we thought that the advocacy of black power was the only way that we can move toward a more truly integrated society. All of us went to an overwhelmingly black university, this one. I mean, white university, excuse me, this one. And even out here, we were saying what we need to do is integrate the curriculum, integrate the staff, integrate the cultural, social, and academic structures on this campus so that they were warmer, less hostile, and more open to people from diverse experiences. When we advocated in the community, we said the main thing is to have more control over the schools so that our children, black children, and other students of color could have a quality education. The ideal of segregation, maintaining segregation, never came up. So I'd like for you to clarify, am I wrong in my interpretation?
I think you're probably wrong in your interpretation. If that's that's the idea that people came away with, then I apologize, because that's certainly not what we were saying. But I think in your question and in the response, I think is embedded a great truth. I think most of the black power advocates were not concerned about integration or segregation. They were concerned about empowerment, they were concerned about control, they were concerned about the progress of the African American community. And I think that's where they came into conflict with a lot of people who were integrationists, who often dismissed them as people who were supportive of segregation. Therein lies the problem. But I understand. I think I understand. Again, I've lived through this period. I was part of this period, and that's part of the problem of talking about this history. We're all part of this period. You all lived through this. You all experienced these things. You guys in this room, there are people who probably had children who were bused. I don't want to see a show of hands, but I know that in this room, there are people who had children. And maybe in this room, there are people who themselves were bused. And of course, you have your own feelings about the whole question of busing. The real issue for, and this is, Larry, this is where I think the dilemma is. The real issue for both the integrationists and the black power advocates was, how do you bring about effective education for African American students? It was very clear that the Seattle school system was not delivering that effective education in 1960, 1961, 1965. The question is, how will it deliver it? What are the strategies to be promoted to try to bring about the effective delivery of that education? And to be honest with you, I don't know if we've figured it out. That's the dilemma. I don't know if we've actually, even now, even in the year 2006, I don't know if we've figured out how to end the achievement gap. I don't know if we've figured out how to ensure the black kids have the educational opportunity so that more of them can be at the University of Washington. The goal that you wanted, the goal that the Black Student Union wanted at the time, has still not been achieved, but it was also the goal of the integrationists, and it hasn't been achieved. And so that's the dilemma that I wrestle with, and to be honest with you, I hope it's the dilemma that you wrestle with, because these problems are not ancient history. What we're talking about right now is a dilemma that continues. What we're talking about right now is not what happened in the 1960s. And I could regale you with stories of heroic people from the 1960s, and you'd feel good about this. What we're talking about is the fact that the civil rights movement of the 1960s did not solve all of the problems, that we have a residue of those problems, huge problems, that continue right to this day. There are some who argue, I won't necessarily say that I do, but there are some who argue that the most salient, the most important question, the most critical question, the most crucial question in American society today is the question of race. The most crucial question is the question of race. How do we resolve that? Hey, if I could tell you that, if I could tell you the solution, I'd be sitting in the White House. All the way over there.
I found it fascinating that when you talked about the schools and you talked about the private schools, that somehow all the people who've taken themselves out of the Seattle school district have managed to actually create, in the private school system, if you will, both integration and a level of educational parity. So I don't know who it's, I don't even know that this is a question for you, but what are they doing that this, well, okay.
I don't know. Maybe there's a commitment, and the commitment includes a commitment of resources. Let me give you an example. If I haven't gotten in trouble with a lot of people tonight, I will right now. let me name names. There's an example called Lakeside. Many of you are familiar with Lakeside School, are you not? Some of you may have actually even graduated from Lakeside. What is fascinating about Lakeside is that 25 years ago, it was almost lily white. There were relatively few black folks there. Lakeside is now, despite the fact that it costs an arm and a leg to go there, Lakeside is now one of the most integrated schools, racially integrated schools in the city of Seattle. So it sort of speaks to the question that you can have quality education and racial integration. Those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. How is it that Lakeside can do it, and I realize that they do have certain resources, but how is it that Lakeside can do it and we can't do it in the public schools of Seattle? And remember, there was a time when it was assumed that that's exactly the role of the public schools, that the public schools would take people with very few resources and turn them into productive citizens. And somehow or another, we've gotten away from that. I think she may have the answer. We'll take her question, and then this has to be the last one.
I think I have at least one of the answers. At the time that I was in school, I graduated in '85, Lakeside was doing recruitment. And I can't remember if that's the exact one that was called the LEAP program, but they had a program that in the summer would invite minority students to come to the school and take courses over the course of the summer and just get a taste of what the school is about. Scholarship was offered, or like at half the cost of coming to school. If you could come up with that money, and your parents were like, "Hey, let's do it." You're off and running at Lakeside.
Yeah, yeah, no.
I don't know how long they did that program, but that's what was happening when I was between my 8th and 9th grade year. So that's who it was targeted at, was those middle school students.
No, I can't disagree with you on that. I think that's probably the case. The problem, though, is practical, that everybody can't go to Lakeside, that there are large numbers of students, and everybody shouldn't have to go to Lakeside to receive a quality education. Every one of us in this room pays taxes into public school coffers, and I believe, I assume, that we pay for the best possible education, and yet we're not getting that. And I think we need to redouble our efforts so that we can make, I know this may seem so far-fetched, not necessarily make every public school a Lakeside, but make every public school approach Lakeside in the sense of its dedication to educating all of the students. That's, I think, the goal that is achievable, even in Seattle in the year 2006. Okay, we'll stop at that point then. Thank you.